John here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are delighted that you could join us here on this beautiful spring day, both in person and virtually. We are here, of course, to celebrate Dominion, the Railway and the Rise of Canada, the latest book by historian Stephen R. Bown. You're in for a fascinating conversation in just a few minutes. We'll also have a reading from the author to kick things off. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you're gathered here in the audience, please just raise your hand and I'll run over to you with a microphone. It's not because we don't trust your ability to project, it's just to ensure that those watching at home can hear your questions and prevents us from having to repeat them. If you are one of those people watching on YouTube, please just write any questions you might have into the chat, and we will put them to tonight's guest as time permits. And then following the event, after closing comments, I'll be back to let you know how you can get a copy of this book signed, but I won't take up too much more of your time. Bown continues to revitalize Canadian history with this thrilling account of the engineering triumph that created a nation. Now, many of you, of course, are familiar with his work. Most famously, recently, he wrote a book called The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, which was the winner of several awards. Bown writes on the history of exploration, science, and ideas. His subjects include the medical mystery of scurvy, the treaty of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Tordesillas, there we go, and the lives of Captain George Vancouver and Rolf Asmundsen, and that book was particularly fascinating. His books have been published in multiple English-speaking territories, translated into 9 languages, and shortlisted for many awards. He has won the BC Book Prize, the Alberta Book Award, the William Mills Prize for Polar Books, among others. His 2020 book has mentioned The Company with the J.W. Defoe Book Prize, a Manitoban institution, and the National Business Book Award. Born in Ottawa, Bown now lives near Bown in the Canadian Rockies. You'll be hearing from him in just a moment, and then shortly thereafter that, you'll be speaking to my boss, Chris Hall. Now, Chris has been with McNally Robinson for more than 25 years, more than 10 of which as owner. When he isn't reading or walking, he loves to travel and cook. He lives in Winnipeg, where he is currently training his 2 daughters as booksellers. But now, please join me in welcoming Stephen R. Bown.
Good evening. I'm just going to start the night off by a brief passage to help set the scene. This is the situation of Ottawa in 1867, just so we all know what we're dealing with. The city of Ottawa, home to around 17,000, was a muddy backwater of seemingly endless construction in 1867. Throughout the 1860s, it was undergoing a frenzy of building to fulfill its new role as the national capital of the country of Canada. Early photographs show the city as a giant work site. Streets, banks, churches, houses, and hotels were sprouting like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Sandstone edifices and survey blocks marking out their boundaries. The streets remained little more than unpaved tracks between the rows of buildings. The rutted mud thoroughfares thronged with farmers bringing their produce to market. Canals were crowded with barges laden with goods, riding the system of locks that connected to the St. Lawrence. Steam locomotives on steel tracks linked the strip of farms and towns that stretched from Quebec City to Toronto. Canal workers, lumberjacks, stonemasons, bricklayers, textile workers, mill workers, carpenters flooded into the city looking for employment. Irish and Gaelic melded with German, French, the burr of Scottish, and some Haudenosaunee and Algonquin as well. Astringent gusts of tobacco and coal smoke competed with the scent of horses, pigs, and perfume, and the sweet odor of wood pulp. Sinkholes threatened unwary pedestrians, and broken, slippery planks on boardwalks tilted to topple people into the mud. Lot prices were rising faster than wages, and overcrowding disrupted the order of life that many in this government town pined for. A new breed of speculators and real estate pumpers boasted of the increasing plenitude of businesses like clothiers and milliners and furniture makers, who would be catering to the rising influx of a more refined cohort. The elected officials and the attendant civil service have been expanding rapidly. These more respectable members of society would promenade the boardwalks in their finery, women in their heavy dresses, dangling parasols, and men in suits and top hats with cigars protruding from their mouths. One newspaper editorial from the 1860s boasted that respectable citizens were only occasionally disturbed by a drunk, staggering into the streets from one of the many taverns and pubs, and rarely accosted by beggars. Few cities in the province have been more free from professional beggars than has hitherto, with the exception of one or two old fellows who were fond of a drop and who solicited a charity to obtain it, pronounced the Ottawa Citizen on March 12, 1867. But this didn't entirely blunt local criticism of Town Hall. The corporation and the police ought to be ashamed of themselves to treat a man that pays his taxes as I do in the shameful way I have been used, wrote one disgruntled dandy on April 9th. I am, sir, a married man, a man of family. I carry a neat cane to assist me when I walk abroad. A day or two ago, I was walking along Sussex Street and my cane went through the knothole in the sidewalk. And in addition to falling and soiling my clothes, my cane, a cane, sir, for which I paid $1.57, was broken in two. Is this the treatment for a British subject in the capital of the country? Is this the way the corporation looks after the comforts of the public? What are our police for, if it is not their duty to see that there are no small holes in the sidewalk laid as traps to break valuable canes in the hands of stead and sober citizens? I trust this matter will receive the attention at the hands of the authorities which its importance deserves. And no doubt it did, without delay. But knotholes in the wooden sidewalks were only one of many civic problems that the boomtown faced, perhaps not even the most important. That same spring, the late change in the weather produced an obnoxious effluvia arising from a large quantity of night soil recently deposited on the summit of the hill on the footpath, which is most disgusting, as well as deleterious to the health of the surrounding neighborhood. The city was well known for hot, sweaty summers where the air could be cut with a knife. The wheels of carts and carriages were rimmed brown with mud, horse shit, and splatter, and gutters overflowed with rotting refuse, periodically washed away in torrential rainstorms. The market stank of dead fish, offal from the meat mongers, decaying vegetables and sewage. But the damp, freezing winters were far worse. Travel by horse sled was the only way to get around, other than clambering over the impressive mounds of dirty ice and snow. And the streets were covered with a coating of frozen manure, which makes them almost impassable, as one letter to the Ottawa Citizen put it on March 25th, 1867. So there you have it. That's the capital of our grand country on the eve of Confederation, before the railway.
All right, thank you for that. Sets the scene nicely.
Yeah.
So we were talking before we came in here about the company a little bit. And I was wondering why we haven't had you before. So you told me why.
2020. Yeah,
At the time.
we all spent a lot of time at home.
Yes, we did. Well, a lot of people, a lot of our customers spent it with your books. It's right up our alley. So I was really interested in getting involved in this book. I enjoyed reading it. It's got life to it. It's not dry history. It's really a compelling read.
I mean, dry history has its place, but for a general audience, I mean, my great interest is all the people that live their lives within the context of these great events that were happening around them. And so I really try to bring it all together to make the whole era come alive, not just cleave very narrowly to the specific narrative, but to show how people were changing along with the time, and to get the different perspectives and different points of view on how some of these large events were, transforming the land, transforming people's lives.
Interesting, the life of the people leads to life in the book. Before we get into the story itself, I wanted to talk about writing history in general in 2023. And you kind of started to talk about it again in the conversation we were having. But in your introduction, in fact, in the third sentence, you write, the CPR was a great triumph of imagination, vision, politics, and engineering, as well as a horrible environmental and social tragedy. And then at the end, you write, in recent years, Canadian history has, at the end of the introduction, it should be clear, in recent years, Canadian history has been given a rude and long overdue awakening from the slumber of certainty, like when the sun in spring melts the snow to reveal a land bedraggled and muddy, but ready for new growth. So you're setting up the book as one that's going to tackle both the good and the bad in history. So why is it important for the
I mean, it is true. The construction of the CPR, which was at the time the greatest engineering feat in the world, was the longest railway, the most technically sophisticated, was a triumph of political vision. The whole idea was to create the country of Canada and the need for a communication system to be the spine of the nation. Otherwise, the country wouldn't exist. So it is important from that point of view. It's a triumph of creative financing. It's a triumph of political corruption. Not that it's something you want to celebrate. It's good to know. It was many tens of thousands of people who actually worked on the railroad were very proud of their job doing it. Many thousands of others actually died. I'm sure they probably weren't very happy about the conditions that led up to that untimely demise. So, so what was it? Is it the great triumph? Do we need to just cheer it and say, yes, we're all on the sunny uplands of enlightenment now? Or do we want to look at the totality of the story, which also included the exploitation of workers, some of them who died, many who just were maimed or injured and worked under horrible conditions, or the Chinese temporary foreign workers in British Columbia who did the most dangerous dynamite blasting work along the Fraser Canyon. Over 600 Chinese workers died on that one section of track. That has to be considered. There was also the resistance of Indigenous peoples here on the prairies. Almost all of them were impacted on it some way or another. I mean, this whole story is sort of bookended by different uprisings of Louis Riel. One in 1870 kicked off the idea of the necessity of having a railroad if Ottawa wanted to actually make what I call an empire. And Canada, in my estimation, began as an empire back then. The second uprising of Riel in 1885 gave the political cover to provide the last burst of government financing that prevented the entire enterprise from lurching into bankruptcy and perhaps dragging the entire nation down with it. So multiple viewpoints. I really like that. There's also, one other thing too, not directly and specifically related to the CPR after it was completed, but railroads in general and the American railroads and the partially completed Canadian ones brought great numbers of additional people out. People brought diseases with them that were unfamiliar to peoples in Western North America, Indigenous peoples. And some of those diseases, tuberculosis and smallpox, ended up completely devastating whole populations with up to 80% mortality rate in certain areas. It also facilitated the slaughter of the buffalo herds, which many millions of buffalo which were the main primary food source of tens of thousands of people all the way from Texas up to northern subarctic Canada. Essentially within a couple of generations disappeared, causing widespread famine and extreme hardship. So, yes, it enabled the country of Canada, but it came at a terrible price, as I said. And it's up to us, I believe, to have some knowledge about how things happened back then, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and so that we can be better informed about the issues that are prevalent today.
Good. Okay, so let's get into this construction project. You set the scene in Ottawa for us. How would you describe Canada as a whole before the railway?
Well, hardly existed. I mean, Montreal was the only city that deserves the name. It was much more sophisticated and had a different history that dated back centuries. It was the center of the fur trade. It was the center of commerce, as well as being the center of New France, which was the most developed in terms of population and European-style civilization. The area around Southern Ontario had been seen an influx of loyalists after the American Revolution, and they settled there. But a lot of it was sort of rural, isolated farms, and mostly illiterate people. At least half the people were completely illiterate and had very little interest in events outside their own narrow world. Of course, the prairies. I mean, the only a lot of it was, well, there was huge population decline in Indigenous people. So already at that time, those nations were a shadow of their former self from even earlier in the 19th century. Winnipeg and this region around here was a fascinating place where, you know, as we know, a great number of things happened. British Columbia had a fur trading outpost at Fort Victoria and had a small town there. I guess they called themselves a city, but we wouldn't call it a city. And until 1858, there was barely a few hundred European type of people there. It was most of the fur trade, which is an entirely different culture. Fur trade always was a blending of cultures, a mix of Indigenous and European style cultures, and all the fur traders had Indigenous wives and families and children. They were a culture distinct, which, well, it's just fascinating. Until 1858, gold was discovered along the Fraser River, and then tens of thousands of footloose miners swarmed up from California and descended into the interior of British Columbia searching for gold, which caused great many social problems, which are, aren't really the focus of my book. But after that time, the colony, as they were calling it, of British Columbia, was trying to determine what its political future should be. In 1867, the US had purchased Alaska from the Americans. So to the north was the US. To the south was the US, was Washington State. All of the commerce and trade and travel from Victoria and some of the logging areas, which were Vancouver would later form, were with San Francisco. In fact, British Columbia used American postage stamps. And it was only the promise of a railway that induced them to even have entertain the idea of joining with Canada. I mean, Canada was a group of things thousands of kilometers to the east, and had hardly even been there, probably. They didn't know anything about it other than some, oh, that's affiliated with the British Empire. Since you're also theoretically, supposedly affiliated with the British Empire, you should join with them. But it was the railway that really turned the tide.
And so in that scenario, then this idea of building a railroad came. So like, what gave it the prompt or the energy to dream of such a thing?
Well, I mean, I'll lay it all at the feet of John A. Macdonald, who's a controversial figure for a whole bunch of different reasons. But Canada really was his dream. He created the eastern version of Canada, and his opposition to Americans and Manifest Destiny, and his repugnance at the idea that all of that territory west of the St. Lawrence or west of Lake Superior or whatever was all surely destined to become part of the American expansion, which it undoubtedly was. And the idea of creating Canada, and therefore the idea of creating the railroad, which was necessary to create Canada, all came with him, and he devoted his decades of his political career to fulfilling that dream. So yeah, another irony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it became very clear to me, you described there was already a railway that, well, more than one, right, that went across the continent, but it went just south of what is now the Canadian border. So you'd go through Minneapolis, I believe.
Yeah.
So that's what you would use to go. Canadians, if you wanted to travel from Victoria, so you wanted to go to Ontario as such,
the delegation from Victoria that traveled to Ottawa to negotiate their potential entrance into Confederation actually took the American Railroad. So I just point that out as, well, yet another irony that there's a colony on the Pacific coast that is traveling on a train through one foreign country so they can head up north into a different foreign country to negotiate whether or not they might want to join that country. And then they reversed by going back to the other foreign country again and then back into their own territory.
So the railway, as it wouldn't have been able to be built much sooner than this. There's some technologies that came along at about the right time that allowed the construction mostly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because you can't, well, in 1860, let's go back. In 1867, Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. And before that, you had to use kegs of black powder. Dynamite had 10 times the blasting capacity of that black powder. Because it could come in little tubes, you could insert it into cracks in the rock or bore holes and blow the stone outward. So it completely transformed the Industrial Revolution from that point on. All the giant mega projects that we think of, such as blasting New York Harbor open for ships, all the canals that transformed Europe and the Eastern United States, all the railway tunnels, all the quarrying of minerals, such as the gypsum that was needed for concrete, only became feasible after 1867. So it was very rapid the change. And the idea of steam power was developed, earlier, but it really took off after that time too, because all of a sudden it was infinitely easier to level ground for making rail beds. And the Americans had a much greater length of terrain. Most of the terrain in the US was sort of flat, south of Lake Superior. You could easily build a railway on it, which is why one already existed there. But John A. Macdonald wanted the railway, the Canadian Railway. He knew that you couldn't have a country without a way of getting across it. Without, you had to stay within your own country in order to travel. And he was desperate to have the railway go north of Lake Superior, which is all Canadian shield, hard granite rocks and bogs. That was basically nearly impossible to do, even with dynamite and the similar explosions of that nature that came a little bit afterwards. Without that, it's not possible. So steam technology and dynamite really also came along at the same time. They enabled a political revolution, because without those technologies, and you couldn't even say, oh, we're going to build a railroad. It doesn't matter. It's not possible. It's like us saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could, go bungee jumping on the moon or something like that? We'd all agree that it was possible. It doesn't matter, the technology doesn't exist. But at that time, the technology was just existing, and it created a political revolution and political dreams, and that's where Canada came from.
So I guess it's more correct to say you could build a railroad because they had it in the US, but you could build it across easier land.
Yeah, that's why Americans had their railway, and ours was so hard to build because the terrain was so much easier for them to traverse there. And then, the American mountains aren't anywhere near as massive as ours. So think of where Rogers Pass is. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's incredible that anyone thought that they could put a railway through there. It's like scratching your head going, what the hell? And or the Kicking Horse Pass. I mean, and along the canyons of the Fraser River. I mean, it's mind-boggling that anyone even dreamed of it or conceived of it or said, oh yeah, we can do that. It's just a matter of, this must have been a very optimistic age.
Yeah, and that's why the word prompt isn't the right one. And there's sheer almost audacity required to dream this big.
Yeah, I mean, it was a crazy dream, and it was the longest, most sophisticated, most technically challenging railroad ever built. And it almost wiped out the entire financial system. It almost crushed the country. Yeah. It was desperately teeter on bankruptcy for most of its time as a business, and it almost dragged the country down with it. And if it collapsed, the entire banking system would have gone, because the loans that were outstanding on it, it was like 95% finished. But it was impossible to unlock the value of that railway if it couldn't be used, and that final 5% was really holding it back. And it was the most technically demanding sections, right through the rock and right over the passes. And it was sort of stuck there. They'd run out of money. They'd run out of, the man hadn't been paid for months. And, we're agitating, as people do when they're not paid for half a year.
You've touched on this a little bit already, but you do an extended treatment of the plight of Indigenous people in prairies especially. Lots of things happening at the same time, confluence of things happening at the same time. Could you tell us a little more about the state of, I guess, the Indigenous population?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely part of the story. It's not obviously directly related to the construction of the railway. However, in my estimation, all of the political developments that happened in and around that time period that enabled the railway to proceed are absolutely part of the story. And I really wanted to cast that net wide and bring in as many different stories and attitudes as possible. And one of those, of course, is many of the Indigenous peoples, they weren't always 100% opposed to it, but particularly on the prairies. I mean, you could see that the new economy, which was metaphorically symbolized by the railway, was moving across the prairies right at the exact moment that all the buffalo disappeared. There was widespread famine and disease. It was a horrible, devastating time for those people. It cannot be understated whatsoever. To almost brush over it as if it never happened, which is what has been done in the past, well, does a disservice to the story, does a disservice to the history of the country, and a disservice to the people who were undergoing such massive and dramatic change at that time. So I wanted to include the signing of the treaties and, you know, the various promises that were offered and as part of the railway story. So I felt that it was very important to do that, to understand what was going on.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about the life of the book, the people. So let's talk about a couple of the people. What can you tell me about Jerry Potts?
Oh, he's just one of my favorite. Yeah, I mean, he's just the enigmatic Blackfoot Picanny war chief, who was also the senior guide of the Northwest Mounted Police for most of his career. I was just chatting about him with my wife the other day about, you know, the irony of, I mean, he was considered to be a great hero to many people at the time, but before and during his time with the Mounted Police, because of his very strong views. He particularly, although he liked drinking whiskey himself and was known to over imbibe on many an occasion, he hated American whiskey traders. And he would hunt them down and shoot them dead multiple times, many times. And yet, well, judge, he was the judge and the executioner of his own. But that was his agenda. Those were the times that he lived in. That's what he wanted to do. But he's such a fascinating character, traveling from, you know, the American-Canadian border was more or less non-existent at that time. So he was based in what's now northern Montana, but he also traveled all over the prairies. He was the guide. He basically ensured that the Northwest Mounted Police didn't just starve to death on their first winter, which they sure would have done. And he was the senior guide that took them everywhere for decades afterward. They couldn't even have existed without him. That's how important he was. They all knew that he was too. He was paid a lot of money for his services, and everyone knew how important he was. He just was such a colorful character.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned the Chinese laborers a little bit, but tell us about Duquesne Wong?
Yeah, I mean, this is a story which I was only able to include it in the book because several years ago, the diary of Duquesne Wong was actually published by a small press. It had lain in someone's attic for a while, and there he was an educated worker on the CPR, the only one, as far as I know, he was the only one in the US, and he's the only one in Canada. Most of the ones who came over from China at that time, they called them the temporary foreign workers of that era, were illiterate peasants from the countryside in China, which was undergoing a very turbulent time period. Civil war, there was diseases, there was famines. The great Chinese diaspora fled out from China. Labor brokers in Shanghai were selling them all around the world. They contributed to constructing the railways all over the world. I mean, they were in Australia, they were in New Zealand, they were all over the US, they were in Canada. You know, some were even sold onto the guano mines off the coast of South America, which was a particularly horrible place to be sent. But Duke Sang. He went to Seattle first, and then he spent I think he spent a decade on the CPR working, and he was able to record all of what happened, the conditions in the camp, how he was treated, how they, from year to year, whether they were doing well, whether they were being paid, the people who died, the injuries that they had, the food that they ate, the scurvy that they were suffering from in the winter. So it's a very, very eye-opening account, and it really enabled me to bring alive an entire segment of that story, which would have been impossible before that diary was found. And yeah, I was so happy to do that, because the book would be diminished without it. Because I think we were talking about this before, over 600, at least 600 people, Chinese workers, died along the Fraser Canyon River during the several years in the 1880s. I mean, that's an incredible thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next they get was the Chinese head tax.
They did get a Chinese head tax that was $50, which was an annoyance to them. And then, after MacDonald died and the new government came in, Wilfrid Laurier was there, upped it to $500. I mean, how does $50 was a lot at the time. $500 was nearly impossible for any laborer to pay. So,
well, it's remarkable how history changes, I guess, our understanding of it with the discovery of such a document like that. All of a sudden, you can get further into the experiences of them.
Yeah, I mean, it helps to bring the whole world alive and understand what was the struggle actually like. Because a statistic is one thing, everyone can say, 600 people died. Oh, okay, that's interesting. But to actually be able to read and have vivid, because he was a good writer too, vivid descriptions of what was their camp like, how was their food, how were they lamenting the loss of more and more of their people from dynamite explosions and diseases and whatnot. And it just brings it home the contribution of those people to the single greatest infrastructure project in Canada's history has gone basically unacknowledged fully for a century and a half now.
Yeah, well, your book really comes to life with these characters, so indulge me with one more. Catherine O'Hare Schubert.
Oh yeah, another fascinating person. Was she the head of the CPR? No. Did she even work for the CPR? No. She was an Irish peasant who came over on a ship during the potato famine, which was, the Irish potato famine is so well known. It was just as devastating in Ireland, the potato famine, as it was the buffalo famine on the Canadian prairies. And I like to draw a parallel between them, because they are, just horrible for the people who were involved in that. And the ships of these people from Ireland came over, and many of them were disgorged onto the docks in Quebec City and Montreal, where no one even wanted to treat them. So they were dying on the docks and stacking up their bodies. And half the people on these ships were dead, with little children clinging to the corpses of their mothers and whatnot. They were just so callously just piled them up like cordwood. I think the description of it was one of the people. And the other ones were dead in the hold of the ship and just lay there. They didn't want to let them out of quarantine. So particularly bad life for her. She was 16 when she arrived, but she eventually recovered. There was no difference between the US and Canadian borders. And she didn't arrive in Montreal. She arrived on a different ship, which took her to Boston. But she eventually came into Canada, and her and her husband and some children eventually found themselves here in Winnipeg, where they were attempting to run a store. And there was a flood of the Red River, as there always was, and they wiped out their store. And that was in 1862. There was a bunch of other Irish people who were saying that we've got to head up to the gold fields in British Columbia. And how are they going to get there? They had no idea. There's no map. There's no road, of course. Certainly there wasn't a railroad. They hired some Métis guides, and they said, let's just take off across the prairies, and we're going to go down the old fur trading route and over the Rocky Mountains. And she signed on. So she was the only woman amongst the entire group of several hundred, and she had some children, and she was actually pregnant at the time. And what an adventure! 6 months across the prairies. Sometimes they would buy some bit of roasted buffalo from some of the indigenous traders that they met, and they ended up going over the Yellowhead Pass west of Edmonton, and then down the North Thompson River. They were almost starving to death. All their horses had died. They were subsisting on rose hips, and she managed to give birth to her baby daughter in just outside of Kamloops.
the way you described them, their final, I guess, few miles, but through the mountains, they're picking their way down these ridges, and their horses really just can't follow them. They have to leave them behind, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. Because how could I mean, it was a dense forest. There was no road there.
Yeah.
So I don't know what they were thinking. They probably weren't thinking.
Except then they tried to build a railroad through it.
Well, there you go.
Like,
That's why I included the story. Because it makes you scratch your head. Or if they just talked to any of these people, they would have said, "Don't even try." Like, what are you talking about?
absolutely, it's set up so wonderful because it's so difficult to get a railroad through there. So describe how did they do that through the mountains?
Well, it took them. I mean, they spent like many 5-6 years sending survey parties out to just, across the prairies was easy enough. I mean, that was like the cream puff job if you got to work on that, right? Because not that it was flat, but it was flatter. The stuff around northern Lake Superior, they knew it was hard work. It was brutal, back-crushing, soul-destroying work in minus 40-degree weather, living in tents for some of those people, with black flies swarming all over them and feasting on them. But the idea of building it there was pretty easy. It's reasonably flat. You can foresee what you would do with it. But once you hit those Rocky Mountains, what do you do with that? I mean, it's like an unbroken line of ice-encrusted peaks that runs the length of the entire continent. So surveyors had to spread out through that and try and identify any routes that might be feasible to build a railway on, because railways can't go up and down very steep hills. They have to be very level grade. And so many of these people spent, well, I would say, years living in camps, wandering up, remote forested valleys to check out if there's any passes, because most valleys don't end in a pass. They just end in another rock wall. And then you have to turn around or turn all the way through it. And of course, it's all dense forest. You can hardly even get a view of what you're looking at until you climb above it. There's things like Devil's Club, these horrible spiked bushes that are growing along where all the rivers grow. It was a whole horrible job for them to do that. And there was hundreds of them. The Canadian Pacific Survey. And of course, the diary of one of the people on the Canadian Pacific Survey has also been discovered in the last number of years and has been published. He was a fellow who came over, a young guy, came over from England and said, "That sounds very adventurous. I don't have very much going on at home here in London. Surely it's got to be some beautiful scenery and probably some good pay, and a really fun time." Anyway, he was disabused of that notion pretty quick. But he wrote this fantastic journal, descriptions of the sun setting on the peaks and the sun rising, or his own feelings of loneliness as he was there by himself, essentially, for all these different years of wandering all over what's now British Columbia, searching for a feasible route for the railway, making the marks on trees to identify it so future people could find out where they were meant to go. And then, of course, there's the pay, the big glorious pay that they're always dreaming of. Well, there was a corrupt person in Victoria who turned out had been siphoning their pay for himself and not paying it out to them. Like things that you wouldn't think is possible. You scratch your head going, wouldn't someone notice they're not being paid? But how would they notice? There's not a road, there's no way of getting to them. They just emerge every half a year or so, bedraggled, and then need a good shave, and they're wondering, where's my pay? I just half a year of my pay. Oh, we don't have it. It's coming.
Well, speaking of madness, they also pick a route before they find the pass. And they're building the route before they find the pass.
Yeah, they gave up on the northern route because they thought, oh no, that's too far north. Americans are going to send a branch line up from the southern US and connect into that area, the southern prairies, and siphon off all the grand, economic prosperity that they imagined was going to be there. But it was always this fear that all of that territory was going to become American. And in fact, that fear is perfectly well founded. It probably would have been, especially if Americans would have built a railway up to connect it to their system. And so they shifted the route to the south, which why it went through Calgary first instead of Edmonton. Of course, Calgary didn't exist at the time. I think in the 1880s, Calgary was 4 buildings. There was a Hudson's Bay Company fort, an I.G. Baker shack or shed or fort or whatever they called it, a tiny outpost of the Northwest Mounted Police, and a missionary shed. That was the grand city of Calgary at that time. But that's where it all changed because the railway went through there where the Elbow and the Bow River intersect. And they started plowing west of Calgary, following the Bow River up into the mountains. They still hadn't found what pass they were going to use yet. They were hoping they hired this famous guy named Rogers, which is what, Major Agent A.B. Rogers, who Rogers Pass is named after. And they sent him out there with a horse series of crews. And they said, you got to find us a pass. We have a year and a half. Don't delay. And, Rogers was one of these characters. He was very, I think the word would be parsimonious, particularly with the food supplies for his workers. Even his bosses at the CPR, especially Cornelius Van Horn, who was a rather large man who loved a good meal. And he ensured that his workers, wherever he was directly in charge, were well fed every single day. Rogers was the inverse of this person, the inverse of Van Horn. He was perfectly happy living his life, eating dried beans and overly salted bacon and oatmeal, loved oatmeal, every day of his life. And so he assumed, well, I love that. Everyone else should love that too. And they don't need very much of it. I just chew tobacco when I get hungry, so they don't need any food either. So we were always trying to cut back on the food supplies of all this men. And there's these letters coming from Van Horn, the other directors, back in Montreal, who were saying, what are you doing? Like, the amount of money we're saving on cutting off the food budget to the men is like a pittance. If you don't find that pass, we're totally screwed. And these letters, they're in existence. They're chastising and saying, please spend more corporate money buying food for the workers. Stop trying to pinch the pennies. But he was so ingrained into him that he just couldn't do it. He's an interesting person.
Another character.
You definitely wouldn't want to work for him or even associate him.
But he found the pass.
So he did find the pass in the very nick of time. They didn't trust him that he did, though, and they sent someone else out to verify. He said, I found it. It's really good. For sure, you can get a train up there.
Amazing.
Really, no problem. And they sent someone to verify. Said, I don't know, because they promised a large sum of money if he found it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he had an incentive to announce that he found it, whether he did or
Sure.
not. Probably could have a whole extra pile.
So there's a Winnipeg story in here because, many Winnipeg stories, but one in particular, there was a real boom here, real estate boom, which turned out to be a bubble and a bust. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I love that story. In the early 1880s, and Winnipeg was booming. The railway was coming through, farming was developing. There was a branch line that had been built to connect it to the American rail systems. Everything, the future just looked amazing. And so people started to imagine, well, Winnipeg is going to be bigger than Chicago. Why shouldn't land cost the same as what it does in Chicago? And Winnipeg is a beautiful area, right? The confluence of the rivers, beautiful farmland. But I mean, Chicago was at that time already huger than Winnipeg. It was a big city on its way to becoming even bigger. It legitimately could boast the need to have high property values. Winnipeg didn't, and it became a speculative frenzy where towns in Ontario were sending representatives out through the American railway system and up into Winnipeg and pooling all the money and telling them, just go buy property, just buy us a bunch of lots along the river. So everyone was just buying houses and flipping houses. And some of these people on paper were so rich, they were like doing the usual things that always happen in these, boom towns. They were, bathing in tubs full of champagne while smoking their cigars, and everyone was like partying all night long, and the whiskey was flowing, and the pianos were tinkling, and everyone was drinking their tea in fine china that was all brought up, and all these real estate speculators were boasting, swaggering around the towns, with their giant top hats and cigars, and everyone said, "Oh, where's the next thing?" And they were like, "Here's going to be the next boom is going to be in this area. And I'm taking offers on my properties." That, it was just going on and on like this whole bunch of sort of windy rhetoric, boasting everything up until one day the river started to rise, and all the supposed I forget the term they call them, the sunny upland lots or the estate lots or something that were supposedly being sold and marketed as being immune to all flooding. Buy here. I mean, those ones were all flooded too. The flood just came, and all of a sudden it's like people just woke up from a dream. It's like tulipomania. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. In 17th century Amsterdam, where, tulip bulbs, you could trade them for large estates and houses, whatever. That's what was going on in Winnipeg. And that all of a sudden, these people all woke up one day and they said, this piece of flooded land by the river is not worth anything near what a giant skyscraper lot in Chicago is. And all of a sudden, it deflated down.
Came back
to there's one classic story of a young guy who came out from Ontario with some money from his parents. And he did what he wasn't supposed to have been doing. He ended up spending big piles of his money on whooping it up. And he went on some kind of spree. I think it was only in his early 20s, so maybe he can be forgiven, I don't know. But he ended up spending large chunks of this money, and he was all hungover, and his hair was all messy, and he was standing in line thinking, oh my God, I guess I gotta go back to Ontario and admit that I was a total failure, and I lost all the money, and now I don't even have a job or anything. He was standing there, and someone came running up to the telegraph station and said, "You, I remember, do you have lot, 32 CX or whatever?" I don't know what the number was. And he said, "I don't know if I do." He looks in his pocket. He's all crumpled and disheveled, and he pulls up this piece of paper with some scratches on it. And sure enough, he's the owner of that lot. And he goes, "What will you take for it?" And anyway, he managed to sell this thing for like 1,000 times more than what he accidentally bought it for when he was drunk one night. And he just smartened up and he said, "I'm getting out of here."
Went home
After all his money, he was a big hero. He got out like, a month before the whole thing collapsed, right?
So the story really intensifies as the clock ticks and it comes down to it. You've mentioned how close it was to bankruptcy a few times, but the investors who are most often treated as the heroes in these tales, they really did put it all on the line. You tell stories of them selling their personal possessions.
Oh yeah.
They were really, they would have been ruined if this hadn't worked. So
ruined.
how close did it come to not, I guess, to ruin?
It's hard to say exactly because it didn't actually happen, but all of these people had, they were very, very wealthy ones at the pinnacle of high society in Montreal, living in mansions, respected people, president of the Bank of Montreal and all the cronies and the associated people. Anyone who was at that level in society was probably invested up to the hilt in this thing. Some of them even had all of their mansions were all completely mortgaged and flipped to help pay for this thing. Even though it had received huge government grants, it received all the land basically for free, which it was then selling off to people as they were building it. Still, it was that section along north of Lake Superior that was sucking all the money dry. In fact, a good metaphor for the finances of the CPR were they kept dragging barges and trainloads of gravel to try and fill in some of these bogs. And the bogs seemed to absorb everything that they could haul in there. They were just literally dumping money because gravel being money it costed to get there. And one time they tried to drive a train across this newly leveled gravel bog. And the whole thing just kind of shuddered a little bit, sort of like a piece of quicksand that sunk, including the whole train line too. You can imagine the money that was just literally in a pit there. All of these people completely mortgaged to the hill. They might have looked fancy walking down the road, but they would have been all completely ruined if it wasn't that. The entire Canadian financial system was like a stack of dominoes, and the little piece on the end was teetering back and forth, ready to knock the whole thing over. And then that's when Riel had his second uprising, reasonably legitimate reasons. And that story's well known, well told. I tell it briefly in the book, just to put it into context. But the events of that uprising, when it finally news of it reached Eastern Canada via the US, of course, with the American agents spying on the telegraph system went through everywhere, that caused a great uprising. What? Once again, our land of our empire is going to be taken by those dastardly Americans? And that's when the Cornelius Van Horn of the CPR said, "I'll get your troops there in," I think he said 2 weeks. You should pay me the money. He said, "We need this much money from the federal government, and we need our dividend back." It was coming up to a dividend payment for the railway. The railways lived or died on their dividend. No one invested in a railway unless they were going to get a big dividend. And they had no money to pay this dividend. The whole thing was going to wipe out. So the federal government came up with the money to pay the dividend of the CBR, kept it in business, and he did manage to get troops out, not in 96 days of hard, brutal travel, like the first time 15 years earlier, but in, I don't remember the exact, like, do you recall what I wrote? It's less than 2 weeks anyway.
Yeah, it was, less than 2 weeks.
So that preserved Canada, that preserved the entire financial system of Eastern Canada from collapsing.
The rail wasn't finished.
It was not finished, that's right, it was
Some
not
parts they
finished.
had to walk.
There's big chunks, and he was in the middle of, it was spring, but they still had to get off in March, and a blizzard moved through and was freezing some of the men as they were trumpeting across these frozen, icy, swampy lakes and catching on to the next section of road that had a train that would ferry them back and forth. And they would get off again and hike to the, the unfinished sections, hop on a new train and continue on. But within 2 weeks, they were able to get out there. So that changed everything.
Compared to 96 days, you said.
Yeah, that's what it was the first time. Like, 96 days of hard travel too. They were bedraggled and not doing very well when they arrived after that.
So I'm going to turn it over to the audience very soon, but I'd like to ask one more. So what was life like after the railway? What had changed?
The change was immediate and huge. I mean, all of a sudden, there were, the economic development, it just took off right away. All of a sudden, what's now called Vancouver, which was actually named by the CPR and created as, it was really just the depot at the end of their tracks. And there was a sawmill there called the Gas Town, a few little buildings. Anyway, they named it Vancouver, and the city built up right around the ships were coming into the port there, unloading stuff on trains and driving them all the way to Eastern Canada. And it happened very quickly. And within 20 years, I think Vancouver went from a population of a few hundred to a few 100,000, all carved out of the forest. So it was lumbering was the issue there, and that wood went everywhere. And the Lower Mainland was all one, it used to be all one gigantic rainforest with enormous trees, was all being shaved down very rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of people eventually came onto the prairies, most of them from Eastern Europe, like some Ukrainians, the sod busters were living in their houses. It happened very, very fast.
And tourism?
Tourism, all the national parks were built at the behest of the CPR, who was agitating to the government to say, you got to create these parks. The scenery is beautiful. And if we know there's a park there, we're going to build a chateau there, and that'll drive increased traffic on our own railway, because we'll make it seem like it has to be the thing that you do to ride this luxury car out and stay in these little castles that we're going to build. So that was all part of the CPR too. They did that. So yeah, I mean, their impact on our country, like I said earlier, the good, the bad, and the ugly is enormous.
And they're running to this day.
They are
every day.
They are.
All right. Well, that's it for me, John. To the audience.
Perfect. Did anybody have any questions? If you do, just put up your hand and I'll wander over to you.
I just wonder if the author has an idea or would want to sort of tell us maybe what he might be thinking about writing about next.
Ooh, good question.
Did that offer? I mean, I will say, this book, Dominion, is a continuation of my previous book on the Hudson's Bay Company. That obviously the story didn't end there, and I wanted to continue, and I was already thinking of it at that time. And now this one, obviously, this story doesn't end either, because the last question that you were just asking, so what happened after the railway was built? That's the obvious next thing that would complete a trilogy on the foundation. I will say I have not started on it yet. Like the amount of work that goes into creating anything like this is just years of hard work. I've distilled it all down to 400 pages, but the number of journals and accounts of people and all their adventures. Yes, I included certain ones, but there's literally 100 of these things or more that you have to read through in order to get like one quote. And it sounds really good when you have it written in the book there, but it might have taken me a week of work to get that one quote to put in there to set into context within the story. So yeah, I do want to do it at some time, but I haven't started yet.
You're still taking a break.
Yeah, I think my wife would come over and hit me on the head with a stick. What are you doing?
Well, that work really pays off. Those quotes, they really carry the story.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that, I mean, I put huge effort into finding them. I think I have a peculiar brain that when I'm reading something, every now and then I'm just reading, and then all of a sudden there's one little bit of text that might as well be glowing green. It's like, I just kind of identify that. I say, I don't know what that is. I don't know what I'm going to do with that, but it's got to be in the book somewhere. And so I just, I type it in and I just put it in the file. And as I'm going along, I find some place where it can go in, set it up, get to the punchline of the quote or the whatever it's referring to, and then move on for it. Don't like to admit it, but you think, oh, it's history. It must be only the important stuff is in there. But when I read a thing and someone's describing that they hunted a skunk and they're describing how they, it was a pretty good breakfast, except for the faint taint of skunkiness that came out there. How could you not have that?
I believe I regaled the staff here about the skunk.
I've never seen it on any menus.
I've never heard of it. Anyone else?
Thank you very much for coming to Winnipeg. In your book on the company, you relied heavily on the Hudson Bay Company archives. You've spoken a little bit about sources for this book, the Dominion, but does CP, the company, have anything like the treasure trove of the Hudson Bay Company archives, where the workers, like the equivalent of factors or officers, required to keep diaries, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, not at all. In fact, I think the CPR was probably not overly interested in collecting that kind of information, because a lot of it was bad and made them look like assholes. They did not want the workers actually they didn't want any of this information on how bad it was to work for them to really get out there, because they were having a hard enough time getting workers as it was. And so no, there's not a lot of information of that nature that's kept by CP, but it does exist. And in Canadian history, in certain time periods, like around the time of the fur trade or around the time of the CP, I mean, there's not a lot. I mean, yes, there's a lot if it's one person trying to go through and read it and incorporate it into a story, but there's not a lot objectively. So almost all of it has been published. Academics have gone through it. They've, translated the parts of it. They've provided annotations on parts that might not have made any sense. And it's either been uploaded on the university websites or it's been published. I ended up buying a lot of books on off of Google Books or places like that, and just read them as an ebook. Yeah, in fact, that's one interesting thing about this business. I mean, this is my 11th book, and I've written about historical things all the way along. When I first started writing, I would pay for and get a special account at the University of Calgary academic library, and I would have access to all of their information, and they would bring in books from all over Canada, sometimes even in the US for me if I waited for it. I haven't gone to a physical library for my last 3 books. Like it's not necessary anymore. And in fact, they don't even allow you access to the books. Like the University of Calgary, they've taken all those older books and they've removed them off site. And you could ask for them if you really want to see the physical copy, but the electronic version is right there. So in fact, it saves me an enormous amount of time. Everyone talks about the productivity gains or losses of new technologies. I mean, in terms of information technology and access to older documents, the digital age has been enormously productive for someone like me.
And we are just at the top of the hour, but if there is a final question, you can certainly put it to Stephen. Oh, absolutely.
So when I think of the building of the railroad and pop history books, I think of Pierre Burton, and you've sort of referenced, previous stories and what they missed. Like, were you talking about Pierre Burton specifically there, or?
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
And I was just kind of wondering, what do you think about his legacy, as a modern pop history writer?
Yeah, good question. Burton was an excellent writer. go and read any of his books, you realize, oh, he was successful for a reason. It's more that we were just chatting about this too. It's been 53 years since he wrote the first one. I mean, I was 3 years old when it came out, and I'm not a spring chicken. A lot has changed in society in terms of our attitudes towards just the different attitudes toward the world and the interactions between peoples. And there's been new information, like several of the journals we talked about in our discussion they didn't exist 50 years ago. They were in someone's attic or in someone's basement or wherever they were, but they certainly weren't available to anyone. So whether he wanted to include them or not, he couldn't have done that because that information only exists now, and maybe there'll be more of it in the future. I mean, I hope mine won't become obsolete too soon. But then again, in 50 years, maybe I won't care.
No, thank you both very much. I wasn't sure if either of you had any closing comments before we move along to the end.
Well, I heartily recommend the book. It is full of life, full of characters. Wow, what a way to read history. Congratulations. Thanks for all that hard work.
Thank you. It's great. It's actually great to come to Winnipeg. I mean, it's the center of so many fascinating historical events at the formative age of Canada's history. Like it's just everywhere. It's all around these rivers. It's all around the land surrounding it, all dating back hundreds of years. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all so very much for your attention. Thank you both for the conversation. We will now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we're going to be bringing Stephen over to a table just beside our cash desk. So please do come and join us. We have copies of Dominion and we have copies of the company. You can feel free to get a copy of either book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the books. We're so very grateful to Doubleday Canada for, of course, publishing this book in the first place, but also for making this evening a possibility, and to the folks at Penguin Random House of Canada. I suppose I should also thank Chris Hall for hosting. Thank you so very much for coming on board, Chris.
Thank you, John, for all your work.
And of course, please join me in giving a very, very warm round of applause to Stephen R. Bown. Have a wonderful night.